Hello, guys, and welcome to Fiat Lux. Today on the show we have Eric from Mel Project and Earendil. Um, how's it going, Eric?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm pretty good. I'm excited to get into the topic today. I I've heard a lot about Mel Project. Quite a lot of positive things. I always hear the name mentioned. Um, Also recently saw an interview you did with is it Charlie
hmm
Shrem, however you say it. Um, and that was really cool. Some interesting concepts in there. There was this like CPI concept you brought up in regards to sort of like I think it was how your what was it? Do you remember this CPI kind of like this CPI like mechanism that you're using?
I think Charlie Shrem actually mentioned it, but basically there is this whole the Mel currency, which is like the Mel blockchain's native unit. It tracks this the cost of sequential computation over time. And I think it was actually Charlie Shrem that mentioned this is kind of like a CPI, except
Yeah.
for like kind of computationally bound services, right? But yeah, like the basic idea there is actually very interesting, which is that one mel, like what the currency unit is, pegged to the cost of running 24 hours of sequential computation as fast as you can. So this is actually a really interesting definition. The idea is that, let's say 10 years ago, a mel would be the cost of renting the fastest sequential processors you can 10
Hmm.
years ago for a day. And right now, the value of a mel would be um, the cost of renting the fastest processor available now for a day. And it turns out this has approximately the same purchasing power. So it's actually pretty stable over time, despite the fact that these processors are very different. The fastest processors are about the same price. The other interesting thing is that you can actually measure this without oracles by this rather intricate game where people kind of like do this like on-chain proof of sequential computation and race against each other and prove how fast your CPUs are. So that's basically the monetary policy, so to speak, of Mel. And I actually think that's the first attempt I've seen of making like a actually decentralized quasi stable coin, like a coin that tries to be stable in price, that's actually usable as a currency to compete against fiat without using oracles or without like price volatility. So that's actually I think like one of the more unique features of the Mel blockchain. Obviously, the blockchain as a whole is completely different from Ethereum, etc. But the currency is also very different. So
Okay. No, I mean that was I guess the best thing to do then is sort of like take it back a little bit and
Mhm.
explain sort of more generally, and then we can like dive deep into that.
Yeah.
Um, what is Mel Project?
Yeah, so I mean, it's just called Mel. It's not like the website is melproject.org, but I just call it Mel. But Mel is basically a block. It's kind of two things at once. So more broadly speaking, it's really a project to build out what I feel like are really missing base layers for how should we put it, like the kind of like next generation of the internet. Like people say Web3, but Web3 hasn't turned into this word that means token stuff and things like that. I really mean what is going to replace Web2, right? It's really about building out the foundational infrastructure for that. And one of the most important things, and the other thing that's called Mel, other than this overall project, is the Mel blockchain. The Mel blockchain is a blockchain that's designed to be really simple, really like credibly neutral, and not need governance as a result. And most importantly, its most important feature is that it's designed around light clients. And so the idea here is that you don't have to sync the whole blockchain to verifiably know what's on it and interact with code running on it. So the idea here is that let's say you're building a peer-to-peer network and you're using, let's say, the blockchain for, I don't know, Sybil resistance or identity or something. If you build this on Ethereum or on pretty much any other blockchain right now, that doesn't work because how do you know what's going on chain? You're going to ask a centralized gateway like Infura or something. And now your whole peer-to-peer network is like held hostage by whatever gateway provider you choose. And the way around this is really pervasive like client support, where the entire blockchain is designed so that anybody can prove to any full node can prove to you, okay, this is what's going on in this part of the blockchain, and I can't lie to you. That's actually surprisingly hard. Like the entire blockchain has a lot of rather surprising features. Like for example, it has a very simple UTXO based model, a little bit like Bitcoin. It also has like very, very long weak subjectivity periods. Oh, all that means is that you can't actually, it's proof of stake, but you have to stake for a really long time. You're not allowed to unstake very soon. But basically, there's a lot of design trade-offs I made to make light clients actually usable and scalable. And the idea here is that once you have this base layer, then you can use blockchains in a way that you can't right now, which is that you can use them to secure off-chain non-blockchain systems like peer-to-peer networks, like Earendil, which I can get into later, and things like, identity systems for off-chain, I don't know, like peer-to-peer chat systems or whatever. And I feel like that'll be at least 90% of the actual value of blockchains in the future. And not, and I also like so I would call this kind of thing like a post-blockchain Web3 almost. You still need a blockchain to secure some small like root or trust things like identity and maybe like value transfer. But ultimately, the interesting things are not happening on chain. The composable ecosystem's not happening on chain. You're not composing smart contracts with each other to build your apps. You're really composing different protocols, such as, I don't know, a file storage protocol, a data transfer protocol, etc., all of which are non-blockchain protocols. You just compose them like you compose, I don't know, HTTP and TCP and those things on the current internet. Except the fact is that those things are possible because you can secure certain things with a blockchain. So I guess that's the whole like Mel vision, the Mel ecosystem, and the blockchain is like the first step to it. We've have a pretty stable beta net running for like 2 years already, actually, and recently we're also planning on kind of releasing one of the last versions of it before we kind of ossify it. But like, that's kind of a summary of what the Mel project and blockchain is all about.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I've heard this term quite a lot over the past couple of months, which is you just used it post blockchain, and you said you kind of prefer that,
Yeah,
or prefer to call it that. And this sort of brings me to something else that you said. You mentioned the Web3 earlier on, and I think sort of in my opinion, I feel like Web3 it was kind of a marketing term. I feel like that I don't really
yeah,
know where that came from, and then it kind of stuck. But it kind of seemed like it was this sort of like kind of way to like because get away from the term crypto because crypto is like associated with like negative things and criminality and all this kind of stuff. And it's also even like phonetically right. It's a harsh word, crypt. And so Web3 is like very friendly. And I also think it's. I mean, I guess it depends what you're using it to describe, right? But in my mind, the sort of like whole idea of crypto is not necessarily like an iteration, right? It's not like the iPhone 1 to the iPhone 2,
yeah, yeah,
right? It's a different way of doing things. It's a new paradigm. It involves
yeah,
politics, it involves
yeah,
economics, et
absolutely.
cetera, et cetera. And so I don't think Web3 is even just based on that, whether it's like sort of on a technical level, like is it the next version of Web 2, like
Yeah,
or philosophical or whatever whichever way you want to look at it. I'm a sort of in agreement. I'm not like a Web3 guy. I prefer to like
yeah. I
not
don't like that word either. Like I've been searching for a better word, but yeah,
well
it's
post
just, like I feel like
post
it just
blockchain is maybe like is filling some of those gaps, right?
yeah. I mean, I feel like the issue with crypto is really like so the thing about crypto is that people usually mean cryptocurrency when they say crypto, and that really kind of further locks you into this current paradigm of let's put stuff on chain. The tokenomics is the most important part of the project. Like all these like ideas I feel like are not very sustainable and not really going to lead us to a better like world, right? And but yeah, like I mean if you mean understand crypto to be like kind of cryptography and all its use cases, maybe. But like, yeah, I feel like it is a hard word to put in. Like there's definitely something to it. Like I always want a word that can encompass everything from Bitcoin to Monero to Tor and Nib and uh, that kind of project, like any kind of thing that really tries to restore user sovereignty and give people tools to freely coordinate without like centralized platforms. But I just still don't know the right word. I wish that Web3 meant that. I actually think it's a good word if it were invented today, right? Like if you think about Web2 versus Web1, that is a massive paradigm shift, right? It's a paradigm shift away from basically people hosting their own servers and like that kind of decentralized server client interaction to a paradigm of massively centralized platforms. So that's definitely a political and social shift, as well as the technical one. And Web3 obviously should be a similar one. Unfortunately, people don't use Web3 in this sense, right? People think their latest NFT game is also Web3. So it's kind of like the best word, I think, is Web3, but unfortunately, it's already acquired the wrong meaning. So we got to figure out a better word, which is unfortunate. So,
I mean, okay, yeah, I agree. You brought up like decentralization there, so I guess my next question is, and it also relates to post blockchain, the post blockchain idea. Um, what is the kind of, at least in your sort of personal sort of mission? Um, is the idea to produce more decentralization? Is the idea um as you were just talking about, kind of like this sort of bigger than just currency idea? Is are you kind of politically motivated? Are you just a tech guy? Like you just really into technology? Like why are you doing this? Like what's it about for you? And then I guess just on to the end of that, like what is it that you're aiming to achieve? What would you like to achieve with Mel? Uh, yeah. So what's this about for you? Like where do you kind of sit? Um,
yeah, I mean, I guess like what really motivates me is this, right? I feel like the biggest problem we have with kind of Web 2 overall is I think that we have a lot of very deceptive tools, right? The idea that, when I go on Facebook Messenger and I message my friend, the tool's lying to me. I'm not talking to my friend, right? Like I'm basically asking Mark Zuckerberg, can you please tell me my friend this and make it show up on her screen? That's not a very and like this is the whole internet, right? It's not just about Web 2 platform. It's this overall paradigm that people are alienated from their tools. They're kind of like tools in cyberspace. And they don't really understand how they work. They trust people they don't intend to trust. And in fact, like most tools people use are not really tools. They're more like services that you ask third parties to do for you, but they're presented with the UX of tools. They are presented with a UX of like, this is a app. When you put a line of text here, it shows up on the other end, and you're not supposed to worry about what goes on. Um, and I think like, I guess like, I was always very deeply uncomfortable with this sort of paradigm, especially since kind of like personally speaking, like I spent part of my life growing up and living in China. Uh, it's really easy there to see how this paradigm can be abused, right? Like more obviously here, right? People say the wrong things on WeChat and then their account gets banned. And because all WeChat accounts are KYC, they can't ever make another one. So like that kind of thing happens. And obviously worse things happen, right? People nowadays it can be worse. Like people go to jail for stuff they say online. It used to not be that case back in the day, but at least people get perma-banned because everything's KYC'd. Um, and you have this like situation where all these deceptive tools are really like tools for this more nefarious actors that control these centralized platforms, big corporations in the state and things like that. And I just feel like if Web3 means anything, it has to fix this. And I was always really interested in using cryptography and technology to fix this. I remember one of the first coding projects I did when I was like a teenager was try to make this browser that had a VPN in it. And I had some friends use it. it didn't work very well. But like, I always found it really crazy that with cryptography, you could build tools that, even ISPs can't shut down, right? Like even states can't shut down. And yeah, so I kind of went on that whole like cypherpunk route for most of my life. And how I started Mel was really I was really into building things like Tor like networks and stuff during my like PhD time. I was doing a lot of research in that kind of thing. I kind of eventually realized that if you wanted to make a system like that decentralized, you need something like a blockchain. And I also got into Bitcoin around that time, and I was really excited about Bitcoin. I actually published a paper on how to embed a PKI into Bitcoin's UTXO graph. That was, I was pretty excited about Bitcoin basically, but really eventually I realized that, Bitcoin's great as a currency, Ethereum's great as like a computer, but because none of them have like really good light client support that lets you fully get rid of trust for like thin clients or like really lightweight clients, you can't actually scale the sort of like highly decentralized and privacy protecting and secure internet on top of that. Like most wallets, literally they just ask an RPC provider how much money I have. Like even basic facts like that, you're depending on other people to tell you. And the entire ecosystem is built around this paradigm, right? All the composability happens on chain. You can't use ENS, for example, as a DNS replacement securely. It just becomes DNS but run by Infura if you do that in your browser. And I just feel like, oh, this is not the right way because, you know, eventually you're going to run out of kind of like base layer focused applications like DeFi and things like that. And what about the 90% other applications, right? What about chat? What about social media? What about file storage? How do you actually make those things really resilient and like break those things free of the whole Web2 paradigm? And I decided that what you needed was a new blockchain. And I actually published my PhD thesis on that. Like, how can you make like composable endogenous trust? That was like the stupid academic term I came up with. But the idea is really like, how can you generate trust and security with economics, but also compose it with other systems off of the blockchain? And I actually think Mel's the first project that really tries to focus on this, but I do feel like it's a really big missing piece in the whole kind of like decentralized protocol stack, so to speak. And yeah, so I guess that's kind of my personal journey, how I got into the space, why I'm building Mel. It's really just about how can you build less deceptive tools when you chat with someone. How can you make it so that the UX actually is um, reflects reality? I don't like my software to lie to me. That's, I guess, ultimately why.
Yeah, I really like the answer. I mean, that's I like the idea. I don't think I've ever heard anyone put it this way. About like you asking Zuck to pass on a message, like you're not actually speaking to your friend, you're just asking Zuck to tell your friend the message. I think that's kind of like a very simple way of explaining it to people. It's probably like quite a good kind of like visual for people. Um,
Yeah.
and also I like you kind of saying about Bitcoin and about how you feel it sort of needs to be about more than just money or currency. And I think that's one of the things that I sort of agree with myself. Like it's you were talking about things on a technical level, right? Like what is the application actually doing? About you were talking
Mhm.
about RPCs and like how are these things getting the information? Am I actually in some sense like sovereign? Is it my
Yeah.
data? Am I in control of my data, or is it going through a middleman or a third party? Or is it trusted, trustless, etc., etc. And I absolutely agree. I think we need kind of like an expanded philosophical, political, and technical kind of vision here.
Mhm.
Because why stop? At like sort of like here the Bitcoin maxis like, oh, Bitcoin's perfect and all this kind of stuff. Um, and I mean, I'm not in. There are some arguments. Just as a little side note, there are some arguments that talk about people. There are like Bitcoin maxis that also appreciate like smart contracts and other different kinds of technologies, and but they believe that Bitcoin should stay as Bitcoin, and like the other stuff, the smart contract stuff, other people can do that. That's not for Bitcoin. There might be some argument to that. Maybe Bitcoin should stay as
Yeah.
hard money. But the general point I guess I'm trying to make is that you're right, right? Why limit ourselves? Like the original, like you were talking about the cypherpunks, and then there's the the crypto anarchists, the sort of
Yeah.
the OG kind of ideas that these things spawned out of originally. Um, they kind of were aimed at that. It wasn't just like, oh, we're just gonna make money and that's it, right?
Yeah. I mean, like I guess like what I really was trying to refer to is not that people want to make money, right? Like Ethereum people also have built a lot of things in smart contracts. I was really referring to the idea that like this whole Web3 community, right? They're doing things mostly on chain, right? Like if you think about Ethereum, the whole ecosystem is based on composable smart contracts calling each other, and the kind of like source of truth, so to speak, is what's on those Ethereum full nodes out there, and they're running the smart contracts. And the technical problem here, that's also a political and social problem, is how do you know that what's going on chain? Do you just trust like Uniswap's website to tell you? Do you like just like trust like MetaMask to tell you? MetaMask uses a centralized provider to tell it what's going on chain, right? And if you do, then you're never going to scale to use cases where most of the value is off chain when the on chain secures that, because your knowledge of what's happening on chain is fundamentally untrustworthy. And that only kind of works if all you care about is stuff that happens on chain. If you get lied to, fine, I'll switch to a different RPC provider. I'll eventually see what's happening on chain. That doesn't work if critical infrastructure that just depends on a reliable understanding of what's happening on chain. So I think like that's really the problem that Mel tries to solve. It's really about blockchains are the perfect root of trust, right? They're the perfect settlement layer for everything. But to kind of cross the boundary between off-chain and on-chain, you need something that's very different from Bitcoin or Ethereum. I would actually be happy, for example, if Bitcoin stayed hard money, and it didn't have smart contracts, but it did add, like, let's say, finality and better like client support. That would massively increase its use cases. It would let me, for example, run a peer-to-peer network where the nodes pay each other in Bitcoin, and they can verifiably see I've been paid in Bitcoin without running a full node. And that will just like probably 10x the application space of Bitcoin just through these smaller changes. It's really about this sort of thing, not really about how many features does the base layer have. So I think like that's what I find the most worrying about blockchains nowadays. Like the focus is all on how many features can we cram into L1, not how can we get the stuff out of L1 to secure other things. So that's what Mel tries to solve.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, I guess I was what I was getting at is that you know let's say you're, for example, right, you can do a peer-to-peer transaction, right, and you're doing
Mhm.
this in a decentralized way, but as you mentioned, like chat clients and things, right, if no one's developing like decentralized, like anonymous, like chat clients that are peer-to-peer, then in some way, even the initial step just to communicate, let's say you do, the start of the transaction was like a message from you to someone else. Hey, yo, do you got
Yeah,
any Bitcoin? Yeah, I'm willing to pay
yeah,
for Bitcoin. Da, da, da. But then like, so right from the get, you're using like like it kind of doesn't make sense. It almost doesn't. It
yeah,
doesn't align, right? And so if the goal is just to do the peer to peer money stuff, it's kind of like, I don't know. It just doesn't really make sense to stop. Like if the goal is like freedom and sovereignty
yeah,
and all of these good things, then it doesn't make sense to stop at the money. Then of course we need all this other infrastructure and we need
definitely,
all these other tools. Um,
definitely.
so yeah, let's dig like into Mel a bit. Um, I mean, where do we start? Right? What's the what would you like to explain to users that maybe they don't understand about Mel, or is there anything that you think I don't know, what is the most, how about what's the most interesting use cases that you've come across?
Um, so I guess like now it's pretty early, right? Like I don't have like a ton of people building use cases on it yet, but I would actually think that one of the most interesting use cases of Mel is this whole like paradigm we're building with the Earendil project, which is something that's built on top of Mel. So Earendil, in short, you can think of Earendil as like something like NIM or Tor. It's a mixnet. It's peer-to-peer. The distinct feature of there are two really distinct features about Earendil. First of all, it's what I call ban resistant. So that's a little different from censorship resistant. The idea behind ban resistance is that not only is it that the Earendil cannot censor your messages, your ISP also cannot censor Earendil. So the network traffic that Earendil produces is indistinguishable from other traffic. So that builds on a lot of research I did kind of back in the days when I was researching like, traffic obfuscation and things like that. Also with my Geph project, which is a obfuscated VPN project. But that's actually very distinct. But I think that that's a big problem that most Web3 projects slash like, whatever word you want to use for Web3 projects don't really solve. Like for example, Monero is censorship resistant, but you can easily just block all Monero traffic. You can find all the list of all Monero nodes just by asking around the peer-to-peer network and then blacklisting it all. And China, for example, does that easily. Um, Rendell really tries to solve this problem, which I think is like an important part for actually keeping everything else alive, right? If one day like the state tries to crack down on Monero, you want to have a fallback like transport layer to run Monero on that they can't block. So the other part is more connected to the Mel blockchain, which is the incentives. And this is actually something I feel like is a really cool Mel application, which is that so you can build something like Lightning Network. It's a UTXO Bitcoin-like blockchain. Obviously, you can build something like Lightning Network on it. However, because Mel has much better light client support, you can actually monitor the status of your channels without trusting some full node, basically. Like your phone can fully participate in the payment channel network without trusting a single other person. And what this actually means is that the way Earendil incentives works is that we have a peer-to-peer network, and whenever we move data along the peer-to-peer network, we pay our immediate neighbor a micropayment over like this payment channel network. And essentially, the peer-to-peer layer isn't fully incentivized with micropayments. And this is actually a paradigm that doesn't work on Bitcoin, doesn't work on other blockchains, because if you try to build this on Bitcoin, every single peer-to-peer node has to pick some centralized party to trust, or they're going to run their own Lightning Network node, which is very heavyweight. Similarly, on Ethereum, you have to pick an RPC provider to ask about the status of your payments. And then you have this like octopus like topology where everything is actually connected to this like a few like providers, right? But with Mel, you can actually build a peer-to-peer network where every node kind of like machine to machine micropays for all the resources they use on each other. And it's all unattended, right? Like the user doesn't have to connect their wallet and then manually click approve on transactions. It's really like automatic. And in fact, like we're also going to build a mechanism where if you run out of money, you mine more Mel automatically. So like it's like this fully automated machine to machine economy of resources, and people bid for bandwidth resources. The algorithm would automatically pick the peer with the cheapest uplink and things like that. It's all unattended, and it's basically this whole like agorist marketplace of automated agents paying each other with like payment channels and being able to verify that everything's going correctly because of light clients. So I think that sort of paradigm is a huge kind of design space that's super underexplored, because before we have Mel, we don't really have good ways of sending crypto to each other fully automated and verifying that it actually happened without trusting a centralized third party. or running a full node. So like once I feel like that design space is opened, I can see a lot of potential in just incentivized peer-to-peer networks overall. And by incentivized, I actually don't mean stuff like NIM, where there's like a smart contract that takes fees and subsidizes people. Just literally when in a peer-to-peer network with peer-to-peer payments for like bilateral resources. Like imagine I'm torrenting and I just pay for bandwidth from my peers and then I pay the lowest bidder, right? And none of that requires a smart contract. It just requires some ultimate settlement layer for these micropayments, which is like some payment channel on the blockchain. Uh, and I think like that design space would make a lot of things much, much easier. Like how can you, let's say, file storage, right? Like you don't really necessarily need a complex incentive system like Arweave or Filecoin. Just pay people, pay your peers, like pay your peers when you download from them, them when you rent storage from them. And if they delete your files, go pay somebody else. It's a free market, right? I think this sort of paradigm, just like this automated free market of peers paying each other, can enable a lot of applications that previously were really hard to build. So I think that's probably I currently what I feel like is the coolest application of Mel. But I think there's a lot of other ones. I like, I think like public key management for encrypted chat is another huge one, right? Like, how can I actually do end-to-end encrypted chat with you and I know your public key without trusting some centralized provider? That's also a big problem. Like that again, you need light clients to solve. You can't solve with ENS because then you're just trusting Infura or Alchemy or whatever RPC provider as your PKI. Um, and that'll also enable just a huge design space that currently doesn't exist. So I think like there's a lot, but I definitely, if you had to have me pick the coolest, it would be this automated peer-to-peer marketplace thing. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, dude. That's really exciting. I love how you explain that. Yeah, just the like you said, it opens up a whole new design space because of the way it. Um, I mean, not only the fact that it's like actually peer to peer, but the lack of friction. Um,
Mhm.
that's really cool. I think that'll be a really interesting thing to kind of think about for a lot of people that might hear this. Definitely cool to think of. I'm gonna have to think upon that and kind of like explore, myself. Like, what do I think that would be like really useful for, and like what? Um, I mean, one of the things that came to mind as you were talking was, um, I wonder how that could be used for compute. Like. I don't know, like video rendering, animation rendering, things
Yeah,
like that.
yeah.
Like, how could you pay other people? I know there's some projects out there that are trying to do that. I think there was like I remember maybe 2 years ago or something seeing some kind of I think it was Rendr or something, and they were trying to do something like that. I've not seen that many attempts at it since. But maybe that's because of the friction and the way that it works, the mechanism, and so maybe the way that you're thinking about things, maybe that's actually the way to achieve a lot of these things like at scale or with some with some kind of I don't know, with a lot of people doing it, but yeah, at scale basically.
Yeah, perhaps. I feel like definitely like if you look at kind of how Web3 projects try to incentivize these things now, it's really based on the centralized smart contract paradigm, right? The idea that let's say we all buy some token, like rendering tokens from the smart contract, and then somehow when I help other people render things, I get subsidies from that smart contract. That's really hard, right? Because like the smart contract then has to verify proofs. Did you actually do your render or not, right? Like it's basically like communism, right? Like there's this like centrally planned economy in the smart contract that tries to make sure everybody is well incentivized, and that just I don't think that necessarily works very well. Yeah, like I feel like in the Mel paradigm it'll be something like there's a peer-to-peer network, anybody can render stuff for anybody else, and if people are like if I pay you and you give me a bad render, you don't render it, I'll not pay you again, right? There's like identity and civil resistance and you have the reputation, but ultimately it's not guaranteed you're going to get your stuff rendered. But the idea is that market forces should push things towards an equilibrium where most participants actually are honest, because otherwise they burn their reputation and possibly like their identity for no good reason. And yeah, I feel like that's definitely a paradigm I don't see a lot of people exploring, which I find strange, honestly. Like I always felt like that was the obvious way to use blockchains. When I first heard about like blockchain incentivization of things, that's what I expected to see. But I guess like this whole like client problem is upstream of a lot of decisions that projects make. So
Okay, I mean, is there anyone that you see that's trying to attack this problem in a similar way, or is there, or like, who are some of the people that maybe inspire you, or the thinkers that are at least close to what the kind of idea that you're talking about here?
for the whole incentivization, I've heard of some projects that try to do like micropayments for like VPNs and things like that. But there's also the Swarm project that like does incentivization for like peer-to-peer and things like that. But ultimately, I feel like the problem is like without synergizing that with like clients, right? You don't really, it doesn't really work, right? Like like if I pay Bitcoin for my torrenting peers, like you need to like negotiate, like okay, look, this is this block explorer, like I paid you this money, and like there's always this friction, and I think that friction precisely comes from like the lack of like really fully automated like client verification, and yeah, so I think like there's a lot of people I think that have tried to do this, none of which have gotten very far, I believe. Um, yeah, and I think that we're definitely probably the first project that I think can succeed in building out a whole stack of stuff that uses this sort of approach. So,
Unchecked governments have eradicated privacy and truth. Those who resist are brought down swiftly, but we refuse to submit. Lunapunks are freedom fighters, protected by encrypted shadows. The future we're building is sovereign and uncensorable. The moonlit night is coming.
LunarDAO is an investment fund based on Lunapunk philosophy. Sovereign individuals assemble squad wealth to leverage collective strength, become investors, and allocate funds into privacy projects and anonymity tooling, building a portfolio of supported privacy assets. By this, LunarDAO supports the developing teams, expands freedom and crypto sovereignty, and captures value in the upcoming privacy cycle. Any member can exit the squad at any time. Members are anonymous, hence can build Lunapunk vision without fear of frozen funds, legal implications, or any kind of repression. LunarDAO aims to move to a full Anon setup and expand the Lunapunk forest of encryption, a sanctuary where society can redefine itself, self-administrate and regain its economic, political, and moral agency. LunarDAO also supports research on privacy technologies, listed in the wiki at wiki.lunardao.net, and educational structures such as Adalin Academy at adalinacademy.org, where people can acquire knowledge and master skills in programming and economy while developing a philosophical frame to generate the future path of the Lunapunk ecosystem. The launch is coming soon. Stay tuned and follow Lunapunk Squad on Twitter. Okay, well, just to take it back a bit, because I was kind of interested in you talked about how the traffic is sort of made to look the same as other traffic, right? I'm wondering if you don't mind, like explaining how is that achieved? Like, how are you approaching that problem? Because I
yeah,
know NIM, you did mention NIM as well,
yeah,
and I know they have their own way of doing things where they make all these packets the same size
yeah,
in order to kind of obfuscate them, or stop them from being basically from patterns being detected and people being de-anonymized.
yeah.
So yeah, I'm curious, like how are you making the traffic look the same?
Yeah, so what NIM does is it has a different purpose from what we're doing, right? So like NIM's whole approach with it, which is like what all mixnets, including Earendil, does, is it pads traffic and delays them so that let's say, if Alice, Bob, and Charlie are all using NIM, nobody can tell their traffic from each other on the NIM network. They're all just like NIM traffic. What Earendil tries to solve is an additional problem, which is, okay, now I can't distinguish Alice, Bob, and Charlie's traffic, but can I tell that it's NIM traffic? Can I tell that it's Earendil traffic? With NIM, it's actually very easy to tell that it's NIM traffic, right? Like, I mean, China blocks NIM, for example, very easily. And like, that's a much harder problem because it's really like you have to blend into other traffic. You can't be obviously say NIM on the packet. And that's the one part, right? That's the protocol obfuscation. You got to use some like innocuous protocol like that could look like anything else. And the other part is not only do you need to do that, you also need to make sure that like you can't the bad guys can't just list all the nodes. You can, the bad guys can't like connect to one node and like ask, hey, tell me your peers. I want to know them. And because that'll mean that if you get one bootstrapping node into the network, you can block the whole network by just asking that node, what nodes do you know? And no amount of traffic obfuscation is going to stop this sort of attack. So how Earendil does it is two things. Like for the traffic obfuscation part, we use like pretty like there's actually a lot of like research in that area, mostly from the Tor community actually, because they're trying to make their thing work in China. But basically the idea is that it's possible to design a protocol where the traffic just looks like unrecognizable TLS traffic. It's just some TLS protocol. There's like padding and random stuff that make it not very difficult to like classify by some classifier. And the more interesting thing is actually that it's active probing resistant. The idea there is that let's say you look at this flow of traffic and you're the bad guy and you think, okay, maybe that's Earendil. I'm gonna run an Earendil client and connect to that endpoint and see for myself if it's Earendil. You have to stop this, right? And it involves the second part of Earendil's design, which is that whenever you connect to a node, you actually have to prove to them that you know a cookie that you've shared with them out of band. And this actually makes Earendil like an invite-only node. The idea is that once you join the network, you don't get to talk to other people. Like whoever invited you tells you, okay, talk to everybody else through me. This is how you talk to me. And they're going to make sure this doesn't go to the hands of the bad guys, right? Like if your friend trusts you, they're going to tell you how to connect to their node. Before they do, you have no idea how to connect to their node. Even if you have their IP address and port, you can't establish an Earendil connection without more secret information. So you have this whole topology where every single bilateral link is unblockable, basically, as long as the two parties trust each other and they don't share this with other people. And if you're a bad guy and you fool one of the nodes into telling you their information, well, you can block that one node. You're not going to be able to block other people because you can't learn other people. That node's not going to tell you any information about other nodes. So that's the overall way like Earendil really achieves being unobservable to ISPs, which I think is super crucial because in practice, right, like when you actually have like state level adversaries to Web3 systems like Monero, they don't go for protocol internal attacks. They're not trying like, I'm going to run a Monero node and do these sophisticated things to freeze Alice's assets and enforce sanctions. No, they're just going to block Monero. Like if you block Monero, you're forced to use fiat or I don't know, like Bitcoin or something that's more traceable. And they've achieved their purpose, right? So in practice, it's always easier for the bad guys just to block a protocol than to block like the fraction of the protocol that they actually care about. And I think that crypto projects tend to focus on that problem, like privacy coins and things like that, censorship resistance by making it so that if you want to block Alice's traffic, you have to block everybody's traffic. While the bad guy can say, oh, I am going to block everybody's traffic. Sure, I'm going to block everybody's traffic. And that's where Earendil comes in to fix that problem. So it's solving quite a different issue from the usual censorship resistant projects like NIM or Monero and things like that. So
yeah, I mean, I did have a conversation with Max Hampshire from NIM, and we discussed kind of what you just brought up. And I thought that was kind of interesting that like even just to think about even past NIM, that there are like a lot of solutions for problems we have that are in a strange way only afforded to us as solutions by way of the I don't know, the political system that we live in. And so as you kind of said, right, like NIM is like great if you're in like a Western democracy, you know, if you're in
Yeah.
like France or whatever.
Yeah.
But then when there's like a different paradigm, and you know, things can be done at different levels, at the ISP level, at the state level, then it becomes a completely different problem. And I guess in some sense, maybe we should be, regardless of like what the users are, we should be aiming for the highest level. We should be aiming for
Yeah, that's
the
exactly the idea.
or planning for, let's call it, you know, designing for the fact that maybe at someday, maybe, you know, France, UK, the US won't be as free, right? Isn't
Yeah,
that kind of
exactly.
the way we should be looking at things?
Yeah, and
Um,
I also think it's not just that, right? Like hopefully, right? Like we don't see that kind of thing happen in the US, but it's also like if we're vulnerable to that, that kind of ensures that that will happen, right? Like so, the idea there is like we already see, for example, like so let me give an example, right? So let's say if the bad guys have a credible threat to just like shut off most Monero traffic, right? Then that's a hammer they can use to say, hey, exchanges or like, people, if you don't stop using Monero, I'm gonna like ban the traffic. And if you don't accept this governance decision to make tracking easier, I'm gonna ban the protocol. And I think it's this sort of issue, right? Like the threat of using this kind of like blocking is always like a problem to the protocol, right? Like the idea that you could actually deplatform a crypto coin, you could actually stop people from using it. That gives you a lot of leverage, even if you don't use that power, so to speak. But if we have technologies that can say, okay, like, sure, like if you want to block it, you can't, that levels the playing ground a bit, right? This is similar to how, like, for example, privacy technology does that, right? Like in the US, for example, with a service like Signal, the authorities can't say, okay, please censor all traffic related to the subject, right? They have to like either shut down the whole thing or not do anything about it. And if we escalate this to either let it work or you shut down the whole internet, that becomes a different game, right? It's really about this sort of thing. I feel like even if you don't think that other countries would actually do this, it's really like having an unblockable technology shuts off a lot of like conversations about should we block it, like can we block it, can we do this to that or that.
yeah, I mean, and just thinking about that, you know, even just taking that approach, I mean, is not only useful, but by sort of as just a side effect, right? Like if you're aiming to make it really hard to shut down because of state level censorship, you know, whoever, whatever, someone, you know, state, the military, whatever, you know, let's imagine some
Yeah.
scenario where they shut down the internet in America, in the US, or it's heavily restricted. Um, even putting that aside, right? There are even other sort of disaster scenarios or
Yeah.
catastrophic things that could happen where just having some fallback, right, some alternative system in place, which
Yeah.
is what we don't kind of have at the moment because everything's completely centralized, everything's run by a few ISPs, a few different
Yeah.
companies, the financial layer, the comms layer, the media, like the social layer, like
Yeah.
everything's like incredibly set. Like, you know, imagine someone. Here's like a maybe more concrete example. Like, let's say, what if someone just like, you know, nuked like AWS and like Azure, right? What's going to
Yeah.
happen then? What, the whole world's internet, like pretty, you know, 99% of websites, just no one can do anything anymore. It's like those two things go down, everyone's screwed. So even just for something like that, even if we're not talking about, even if, you know, we're not planning for those things, I think just as a like beneficial side effect of having that as your aim, you also get these other qualities, or
Yeah.
properties, you know, out of the
Yeah,
system.
definitely. Although, like, I actually feel like the internet's like comms layer is actually more decentralized than people think. Like if somebody nukes, let's say San Francisco, the internet's going to keep running. It's just that lots of websites will be gone. The internet's going to still be around, right? Like, and that's kind of what Earendil relies on too. The idea that, the bad guys, they can censor the internet. They can really filter and monitor it. But ultimately, right, like it's hard to make it so that, like, if you actually shut it down, it's hard unless you want to cripple the whole economy. So as long as we can find these peer-to-peer links that are unobservable, and we kind of decentralize that to the market, right? Because of the incentive system, everybody is incentivized to find profitable ways to get their message to the next hop. Uh, then I think like it's highly resilient. It really depends on the idea that internet infrastructure is relatively resilient. And even when it's not hard to just like get a microwave dish and run IP over it, right? And but yeah, just responding a bit to your point on like disasters and things like that. Like Earendil is quite interesting for that purpose too, because of its whole incentive system, right? The idea here is that let's say, due to some disaster, I don't know, all the cables across the Atlantic are cut off, and traffic can't get between the U.S. and Europe. Well, the thing about Earendil is really that if you control the only link between all these people and all that people, you can charge really high fees and profit from it. Oh, well, until somebody else figures out a better way, right? So we're really like unleashing the ruthless power of capitalism, so to speak, to solve internet shutdowns.
I was gonna say, yeah, that, because in the visual in my head, right, there's like sort of a, in the same way there's the concept like a power vacuum, in the same way there's like an economic vacuum, right? So like
Yeah,
everyone would see, whoa, this one dude's getting like this so high
yeah,
price, and then all of a sudden you see this massive rush, and then obviously the price comes
yeah,
down, but then
yeah,
it's decentralized, and
yeah.
yeah, I like that. That's cool. Like, yeah, the full force of it. That would be really obviously I hope that doesn't happen, but it'd be really interesting to see, how that would play out. I love that idea.
Yeah. And I mean, we actually already see something like that happening in China. So, a lot of Chinese users, the way they get across the firewall is through kind of like underground VPN. So, not like because mainstream VPNs are so trivially blocked, like you just download, I don't know, NordVPN, open its software, and block every server in it, and you're done. So instead, what people do is they ask around their friends, they ask people outside China to run VPN servers, and then share them in Telegram groups. And it's a for-profit industry, right? People like make a lot of money off of this, and there is this very cutthroat and very efficient market of like people outside China with access to cheap bandwidth, with good connections to China, which is actually rare because China's international links are also very congested. So like you would have some guy who has a whole room of like servers in some apartment in Hong Kong, connected to a residential internet, and just selling like VPSs to people who need a server with a residential internet in Hong Kong, because that internet has a special peering agreement with mainland China that lets it get across all the congestion. And then you have these VPN providers buy from these people with apartments in Hong Kong and server rooms in their house, and they run VPNs and they sell them in small groups to Telegram, making sure not to let this connection information out to the wrong people, right? It's a very decentralized market, and it's huge. Like pretty much every kind of like tech savvy friend I have in China uses this market to get across the firewall. Um, and and most people are not in it for the ideology, they're in it for the money. Like they're like they don't care about internet privacy or freedom or whatever. They just see this profit opportunity and do this arbitrage. And I feel like this is what I envision Earendil to be like in the future, right? Like you have all these markets, especially in places like China, that actually need this sort of things for, connections and, efficient packet moving technology that lets people profit from it, and in the process advances internet freedom. It's actually really crazy. Like you can find all sorts of stuff for sale on this Chinese underground market. Like there are people with, let's say, connections in the government ISPs that have leased like this dedicated link across the border that doesn't go through the firewall, and then they just sell capacity on it, like for a very high price, obviously, because people use it for gaming. because gaming is very latency sensitive. They can't have their gaming traffic line up with everybody else at the firewall.
Wait, dude, you're saying that people are paying like corrupt state people that work
Yeah,
for this like to play like low latency games, dude?
exactly. Like it's
Dude, that's
ridiculous.
crazy.
Like it's because of this whole liquid market, right? Because let's say, if I work in an ISP, I have access to it's not like just not necessarily corrupt state officials. Like I'm an ISP employee, I can secretly install this link for you, and like basically, but I'm gonna charge a bunch of money, and they all use crypto. Like it's all settled with actually USDT on Tron. This whole market. So like it's quite amazing. And if you can make this frictionless and micropayment based and automated, I think that'll be a super exciting world to be in. So
I mean, do you think you have a unique perspective, or maybe I might even say in some ways like a form of like not quite foresight, but you're compared to a lot of the crypto world, right? It sounds like you're coming from a perspective of planning for more of a worst case scenario, and there's kind of a framing or a paradigm of perspective that maybe kind of a lot of people in the more Western places that Western devs and these Western crypto companies and projects that I guess because they have no exposure to these kinds of things, maybe they're not taking them as seriously. They're not able to plan for them because they haven't seen them in action. Like what you just said almost immediately made sense to me. I guess I'd just never heard it before and I'd never really thought about it. But like as soon as you said, oh, well, there's actually like this really ruthless market for people to get these internet connections. I'm like, well, of course there is, because if everything's blocked and people are only human, like the market's going to take care of that. Like that's just going to happen. So when you said it, but no one I'd never heard about these ruthless markets before, but it makes obvious sense once you say it. So yeah, I'm wondering, do you think that gives you like a unique perspective, having like being exposed to things like that?
I think so. I actually think like it's something that, I feel like everyone in this space should think about. I'm actually happy, obviously, that, recently there's a lot of interest in like the lunar punk concept, which is about like preparing for the worst case. But I feel like one thing that's missing is that a lot of people in Western countries, for them, like lunar punk is like this like dystopian sci-fi future. Like, what if like one day like they really want to like they delist Monero and they want to crack down on crypto, and people don't know what that looks like. Well, like I'm telling you, you know what that looks like. It's China. Like you just like if just develop your application with a threat model of if the whole world belongs to China, can it run or not? That's like how you should think about it. It's not that hard. It's to model. It's just like you have this community in China already that does all these like agorist, like lunar punk dark forest stuff. It's just not very visible. I think there's also like this cultural mismatch going on. So I think that Westerners are exposed to these ideas of crypto anarchy and like agorism and like freedom and all that, but they don't have the kind of like real, they don't see that in action. I feel like most Chinese devs see that in action, but they don't know the ideas. So like there's this cultural mismatch, as in, I feel like most of the people in this, let's say, underground VPN market have never heard of ideas like, crypto anarchy, right? And it's just what they figured out would work, right? Like they have to take their payments in crypto and like use like encrypted chat messengers. Otherwise they go to prison, right? And but like they just figure that out by themselves. They're not interested in the ideology. And Chinese devs in Web3, they use like these markets to get across the firewall all the time. GitHub's blocked in China. Like this is a basic necessity for the whole tech community there. But I think they don't reflect. I feel like most Chinese devs don't really reflect on what the kind of like political and social implications of all this tech that they use all the time. And yeah, so I do feel like there's a cultural mismatch, and kind of like I feel like if we could bridge this gap a bit more, right? The people, the praxis of the Chinese and the ideas of the Westerners, then you can actually build something really beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the things I've said this a couple of times on this podcast. One of the things that I often bring up and use as an example as to why privacy should be more important, should be more part of the general crypto conversation, and that example is, I guess also China is included in this, but I usually say when I ask, sort of like solar punks, let's say, if we're using that kind of like, solar punk versus lunar punk dichotomy kind of thing. The more solar punk leaning people, let's say, or the people that aren't as interested in privacy or don't see the need for it, just haven't got there yet, they haven't explored that topic yet. Often I say to them, like I get the idea of this like radical transparency, and like if it's like only the institutions that are using like the public blockchains where everyone can see everything, and it's it's just the government that are using, that's great because we can see that they're not being corrupt. But then I usually say but like how would that work for North Korea? Like, aren't those people like important too? And usually when I like say that, people kind of instantly like understand the necessity for private. Like, it's really hard to like not understand that. Like, oh yeah, of course. Like, if the state's like, like spying on all of the traffic and like they're blocking things, and well, yeah, of course it's going to be of not no use, but it's going to be extremely difficult to get anyone to really take that with any seriousness, because it's going to put them at a significant risk to their life. So it's like, I feel like that's like a kind of good way to put it to people, and I kind of like that you as you were talking about the lunar punk, and I think you mentioned cypherpunk as well, and you were saying how it kind of has this it has like a dark aesthetic, right?
Yeah.
And Rachel Rose O'Leary, I don't know if you've been watching any of her talks. She talks about kind of flipping this kind of narrative, or this perspective on what lunar punk is, just because the aesthetics are somewhat dark, right? That doesn't make it necessarily negative, right? But that's kind of what people associate. But she's trying to kind of change that narrative and say, look, no, this is like an evolution of cypherpunk, and it's actually, we're actually including kind of like we're trying to not just be about I don't know, like the sovereign individual kind of stuff. We're actually, the lunar punk ethos is also about squads. It's also about being social. It's also about communities, and so it's not just all about the individual. It's trying to rebalance the equation. But what it made me think of is I guess, is when we're talking about like perspectives, it's interesting to think that actually maybe someone maybe like yourself, or just like people that have lived or grown up in China, for example, might look at lunar punk and not see it, sort of like, or not perceive that to be as negative as someone that was born in, like, their default perception of that aesthetic and those concepts might actually be seen as more positive. Does that make sense? Like,
I think like it depends. I like from my personal experience, actually, right? Like, I feel like when I first got into lunar punk, I was actually slightly put off by the dark aesthetic, right? Because for me, like, the purpose of these technologies is more like to shine lights in dark places, right? Not to like make dark places, right? Like, there's enough
that's
dark places.
that's the name of the podcast. FIAT LUX,
Right?
let there be light, enlighten. Yeah.
And I think like I feel like basically I feel like I can't speak for other people, right? Like, as I also have touched on, I feel like Chinese people tend to be somewhat non-ideological overall. It's a very like cultural thing, I would say. But just from my own perspective, I kind of tend to associate this sort of thing with more like associated sort of like crypto anarchist or whatever thing with a more light colored aesthetic, if that makes sense, and a more kind of like, solar punky aesthetic, if that makes sense. And I think the reason is because, and I feel like it boils down to this, right? For somebody living in China, the idea of building a parallel society that's free and open and encrypted online, that's a very optimistic vision, right? That's a very like forward-looking optimistic vision that shows a path out of the current social political order that's they're dissatisfied about. I feel like that's a very different perspective from, let's say, we're in this Western democracy that talks about, open society, freedom, democracy all the time. But to subscribe to those crypto ideals, you have to first be really pessimistic about kind of like Western democracy and pessimistic about your own future. So I guess that gives you a very different aesthetic than somebody coming from a worse place than kind of that cyberspace space world. So it's like really, I guess, about is it about like, when the world falls apart, we still have a little like dark forest to huddle in? Or is it about like the world has already fallen apart and this is the way we can build out of it? So yeah, I think it's a very different perspective. And um yeah, again, right, there's a slight cultural mismatch, I feel like. And it's one thing I've noticed when talking to, let's say, more Chinese people, etc., is that when I describe my work as like in kind of like lunar punk terms, I like, oh, what if the whole world is like China and like block stuff? They don't really get it. But when I actually put it in terms of, like anti-censorship software like VPNs and things like that, like it lets you talk to people when the website's blocked, and it lets you like get out of this whole like capital control regime that the Chinese have with money, etc. Like that's a lot. That seems much more appealing and like much more kind of grounded and optimistic than the typical way lunar punk is put. So yeah, I think like also another thing I feel like lunar punk in the West tends to be associated with like being very politically radical. I feel like from a kind of more Eastern, so to speak, perspective, it's more like how do you live a politically normal life when uh, the meat space, political space is radically authoritarian. So it's a little different, the perspective, right? But like, I still really like lunar punks. I consider myself a lunar punk. I feel like as people in Western society, we need that kind of mentality. We need to be careful not to like kind of like just feel like everything's going to be fine and like, oh, we're going to be like Star Trek and like people will have this nice future without us having to fight for it. But I do feel like the perspective is quite different compared to somebody who already needs to use this sort of crypto technology to even, I don't know, watch cat videos on YouTube, right? Like it's a very different perspective. So
Yeah, no, that was basically pretty much encapsulated the way you said it. It was like that's what I meant. Like the people in the West would see it as, oh, that's like a radical thing, whereas maybe from like the more Eastern places, they'd say, oh, that's just how I live like normal life. Like that's just back to
yeah,
normal.
exactly. Yeah.
That's what I meant. It's like a very different way of you starting from a different base, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's really.
Recently, I've actually heard this whole statistic that something like 30% of all international web traffic is VPN traffic, right? Like we don't imagine that in the West, but in most places in the world, people use VPNs much more than we do in the West because they want to get across like blocking, or they just want more privacy from their local government, right? They trust them less. So
Yeah, and I mean, I would wonder how much of that traffic was people just trying to watch shows that they're not supposed to watch on Netflix. Like because there has been
sure.
because there's been a massive. I mean, every single podcast out there is sponsored by some kind of VPN provider or has been at some point. It's
Yes.
like the
Yes.
VPN thing's crazy. I've discussed it many times. I don't want to like bore people with the same spiel, but I'm not a big fan of it. Like, obviously, I
Yeah.
like VPNs, but I don't kind of. There's a lot of marketing in the West where
Yeah.
and it's like, oh, hide from the government, da da da, and it's like
I mean,
that's not
like,
the reality.
yeah, not at all, right? Like, I mean, I'm not a big fan of that either. Like, most VPNs, I feel like they worsen your privacy because now, like, literally all your browsing history is tied to this one account on that VPN. Like, in fact, like, so I have this other VPN project called Geph, right? And one of the distinct things about it is that it actually uses anonymous credentials. So like when you log into Geph and connect, you're showing a proof that you're some user that paid, and the server has no idea which one you are. Like it's cryptographically protected. And I feel like that's something like that should be basic, right? Like otherwise you're just worsening people's privacy by putting all their traffic in one place. But yeah, I do feel like VPNs tend to over advertise, but I feel like even the fact that that kind of advertising appeals to people really shows that there's a lot of demand, like latent demand for this sort of more individual sovereignty, more freedom for what people perceive to be untrustworthy systems. Yeah.
Yeah, that's also, yeah, that's very true. And I guess in some ways that kind of brings us full circle, right? Back to the whole idea we were talking about right at the start. And that is, there are many parts of the stack, right? It's not just about, oh, okay, we've got like a blockchain now and we've got, like we can trade currency. Like, what about all the other stuff? What about all the infrastructure? And so I think, as you're saying, right, people have this general distrust, but the mistrust once kind of, I guess, actualized or like put into practice, right? They take some action. Is like buying the VPN, right? And I guess the kind of point is that we need to, and or they hold a little bit of Bitcoin on Binance or whatever, right? It's
Yeah.
kind of like I think it's just very important to expand people's minds and have like a more philosophically, politically, and technically accurate or an accurate approach, I guess, to the problem, and not just
Yeah.
I think that's, like you said, it's good that there's probably a lot of mistrust, but again, then the question is like,
Yeah, definitely.
is that mistrust guided into a solution that,
Yeah.
well, one, as you just pointed out, could make the problem worse, right?
I mean, I feel like, honestly, like, I'm somewhat optimistic about this because, when that actual, when like, it's one thing when you're like in a Western country and you're suspicious that, the government's tracking you. It's another thing when you literally can't go on YouTube and you have to find a way, and the government actually blocks all VPNs they can block, and you're forced to figure out this like whole like darknet market for VPNs, right? Like, and I feel like in China, right? Like, just from my personal experience, especially more tech savvy users of VPNs, they're very proficient with security. Like, they know which software to use. They know to put untrustworthy software in virtual machines, for example. People don't even do that like here in the crypto community like as much, and they hide their tracks when they discuss like politics and things like that because they need to, right? Like they're actually in a situation where it's not just like they're mistrusting the government, but the government actually forces them to use these tools because the other tools are unavailable. They can't just use NordVPN because they saw it on an ad. That wouldn't work, right? And they can't just hold their Bitcoin and Binance because they can't pass KYC. Do you get what I mean? Stuff like that. But and I think what's missing is how do you connect this with the rest of the world? But I feel like that's where the market comes in. So let's say you have Earendil and you have like a bunch of people in places like China and Iran using Earendil and generate like having demand for secure like links out of the country on Earendil. And you will have a community of people outside of these places that have to understand what these people need in order to make money, right? So, like, the idea here is that your kind of like yield farmers would actually have to get into the weeds and understand what people in China need to get across the firewall so that their nodes don't get blocked. Because if their nodes get blocked in China, they lose a bunch of money. And so, like, I feel like once we actually have a kind of like free exchange between people in more dire lunar punk circumstances and people in less dire, possibly solar punk circumstances, and that's how we get the ideas across. Right? That's how we kind of like form this community where we weed out the bad solutions and have the good solutions because we're all connected with the same marketplace. And so I feel like it's a matter of time, really, before kind of like these arbitrage opportunities get arbitraged away, and we in the West know to like what people actually in those circumstances need. And that's actually a big reason why I'm like for Geph, right? Like I made it a principle to not take funding from like nonprofits or governments, et cetera. The idea is that I want to figure out how to make it profitable and actually get people to use it and use market forces to guide the development. And it's worked pretty well. It actually subsidizes some of my costs for developing these newer projects too. And we have like almost 500,000 users on Geph now. And like overall, I feel like the kind of money part of Web3 can really be utilized for this, really like serving these like unserved people who need internet freedom and privacy and security a market so that people will learn about it, serve them, and make the whole world a better place and make money. And I think like, yeah, I think like my experience with that really makes me a lot more comfortable with kind of like profiting off of these people. I just feel like that's actually how you get real useful research and development done. So.
Yeah, I mean, just at the end there, you were saying something that reminded me of the. I'm sure you've heard of Helium. You know, Helium project.
Helium?
Have you
Yeah,
ever heard
I've
of
heard of
Helium?
it. Yeah,
It was
yeah.
like, I think it was like developed by the guys that did Napster, like back in the day.
Yeah.
But no, I thought this is a good example of, because you were talking about incentive models and you know how we can get people, how many like get people to use these things, and while it's like it's a good example of like successfully distributed infrastructure, maybe not the best example because it's kind of closed source and it doesn't
Yeah.
really do that much. But
Yeah.
looking at like the scale of things and how they managed to create this like huge like mesh network in basically no time and spread it across the world, has
Yeah.
always been like insane to me. Like that was
Yeah.
like, that's kind of like, again, putting aside the bad parts of the project, like it'd be like, it would have been so sick if you could have just run Helium on like a Raspberry Pi and they didn't like
Yeah.
close it all off. Like that was just such a lame move. You know, they could have been like heroes of like crypto in some way, and like because people could have developed on the Helium
Yeah.
boxes that they all had in the homes, and then it could have become something else. You know, like it could have been something totally like game changing. But
Yeah.
instead they went a different direction, and it's
Yeah.
not. But no, I always like that as an example, just of like, look, like these things can work. Like there is an example, while it might be so great, like it's a huge mesh network. And
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
just cool.
exactly. And I feel like with Web3, we can actually build like decentralized incentives to make that work without having to make a closed source so that the devs get to eat, right? Like we can fund it in a different way and make it much more open and decentralized. And yeah.
Agreed. So we're coming up to the end of the show now. I just want to give you a chance to basically say anything you want. You've got the floor. If there's anything you think we missed, if there's anything about either Mel or Earendil that you want to explain, or you know, if there's not, if you feel happy there, I guess just tell people where they can find you. You know, websites, socials, telegrams, etc., etc.
Yeah, I think that like one thing I would like people to know is that we recently launched the first like pre-alpha of Earendil, so you can actually run nodes already, and there's actually an incentive program for that where if you run nodes, you actually get free Geth accounts, so you can use VPN for free. So like, you know, that's the nice thing about having this other project on the side. And we already have like several dozen people, mostly in places like Iran and China, actually running nodes and testing it out. And you can be one of them. And if you're interested in kind of like decentralized ban resistance, definitely check the project out and contribute nodes. The website is earendil.network. So Earendil is EARENDIL. And Mel Project's website is mel project.org, and you'll be able to find much more info about the projects on the websites.
Yeah, guys, if you're interested in what we've been talking about, if you're interested in helping people in China and Iran, definitely give it a test. Well, it's been great talking to you, Eric. I really appreciate you coming. I feel
You
like I've
too.
learned a lot. And I actually would have liked to dive, if I'm being honest, dive more into Mel and Earendil and maybe more like the technical side. But I was enjoying just the flow of the conversation, some of the things we were talking about. So maybe at another point, or if people want to check it out, you've just heard where to go to find out more information. If you want to go a bit deeper and look at the kind of the more technical side, look at the code, etc. Obviously, all the links. I'll put all the links in the description as well for people to click. So yeah, again, thanks for coming, Eric. This has been Fiat Lux, and we'll see you guys in the next episode. Peace.